introducing speakers, I'm not a huge fan of reading off impressive resumes because I believe that you shouldn't have to be convinced by a high pedigree to pay attention. But in this case, I don't think we're likely to see a resume or a description quite as impressive as this one for a while, so let me just read some prepared things. Bryan Stevenson is the Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative of Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama, and also a Professor of Law at the New York University School of Law. As Executive Director of EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, Mr. Stevenson represents indigent defendants, death row prisoners, and juveniles who've been denied fair and just treatment in the legal system. Mr. Stevenson's work on behalf of condemned prisoners has attracted national recognition and acclaim from the Washington Post, the New York Times, People magazine, Life magazine, and several national television programs including Nightline and 60 Minutes, which featured a case where he and his staff achieved the release of a death row prisoner who spent 6 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. Mr. Stevenson has won numerous awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship, National Medal of Liberty, Thurgood Marshall Medal of Justice, Olof Paine Prize in Stockholm, Sweden for International Human Rights. In 2004, he received the award for courageous advocacy from the American College of Trial Lawyers and also the Lawyer for the People Award from the National Lawyers Guild. And if you aren't convinced yet, and the Concord people will be sort of swayed by this one, he's also on the board of directors of Partners in Health. Bryan Stevenson.
Thank you. It's a real honor for me to have an opportunity to share with you. It's extraordinary and wonderful that people in this community have come together to talk about, to think about human rights, to think about social justice. At a time when there's so much fear and there's so much anger, it's incredibly affirming to me to know that many of you are struggling to find ways to say something that creates hope, that creates the opportunity for justice, that creates fairness. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think there is something incredibly important about those of you who are willing to say things. Sometimes when it's not comfortable, sometimes when it's not easy to say the things that need to be heard. My grandmother actually taught me about this when I was very young. I grew up in a household where there were a lot of kids and there were a lot of people, but my grandmother was the definitive matriarch. She controlled everything. She was this incredibly powerful, this incredibly strong, this incredibly loving woman who had this quality about her that you always wanted to be near. She was the daughter of slaves. Her parents were born into slavery in Virginia in the 1840s. She was born in the 1880s. And the experience of slavery very much shaped the way she was raised, and very much shaped the way she saw the world. She had 10 kids. My mother was the youngest of her 10 kids. And the only problem with my grandmother, with our mama, is that because she had so many kids and had so many grandkids, there were always so many people around competing for her attention. And I remember when I was about 5 or 6, or maybe I was 7, being with her and always wanting to be near Mama, because she would just hug you in this way that made you feel so loved. She would say things to you in this way that made you feel so empowered. And when I was about 7 or so, I was staying with her one morning, and I got up, and I was in the living room, and there were a bunch of kids around me, my cousins, and my grandmother came over to me, and she grabbed me by the hand. She said, "Come on, Bryan, you and I are going to have a talk." And she said, "Come on out back, and I'm going to talk to you about something, but you promise me that you won't tell anybody else about our conversation." I said, "Yes, Mom." She grabbed me by the hand and she took me out back and she sat down and she told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "I've been watching you, and I want you to know that I think you're special." She said, "I believe you can do anything you want to do." And I can still hear her saying that to me now. And then she said, "But I want you to promise me 3 things." And I said, "Yes, Mom." She said, "The first thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always love your mother, no matter what. No matter how you feel about something, no matter what you're thinking about, promise me now you'll always love her and you'll always take care of her." And I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." Then she said, "The second thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always do the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing. And I said, yes, Mom, I'll do that. And then she said, the last thing I want you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol. Well, I was 7, so I said, yes, Mom, I'll never do that. I have a brother who's a year older than me and a sister who's a year younger than me. When I was about 15, and we grew up in the country, and I was home one day, and my brother came home, and he grabbed me, and he grabbed my sister, and he said, come on out back, I've got some beer. And we went out back, and he opened up this can of beer, and he gave some to my sister. He took some, and then they offered it to me, and I said, no, I don't think I'm going to have it. And he looked at me real hard. He said, come on, I had some, your sister had some, you always do. We do have some beer. I said, no, I don't think I feel right about that. And then he looked at me real hard, and he said, I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had. I said, what are you talking about? He said, oh, Mama brings all the grandkids out back, and she tells them. I'll tell you, I was devastated. Completely devastated. But I'm going to admit something to you that I probably shouldn't admit, but I'm going to admit it anyway, because you all have come together, and I want to sort of be part of this community. I'm going to tell you that I am 45 years old, and I have never had a drop of alcohol. And I don't say that because I think there's anything virtuous about that, but I say that because I do think there's power in words. And sometimes we can create an identity for ourselves so that the things we say have meaning. And I really don't believe my grandmother was. I think she really did think all of her grandchildren were special. She had this idea, and it might be silly, that these were the things we needed to do, and it meant something to me to respond to that. Well, there are people in the world who are trying to say things about injustice. They're trying to say things about poverty. They're trying to say things about inequality. You're reading about my good friend Paul Farmer, who is trying to say things about the way in which poor people on this planet are oftentimes doomed by illnesses in ways that they should not be. We have in our work been trying to say things about the fairness of the criminal justice system. This is a very difficult time for lots of people in this country. In 1972, there were 200,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2 million. In many communities, this kind of mass incarceration has had devastating consequences. Right now in the United States, 1 out of 3 black men between the ages of 18 and 30 is in jail, in prison, on probation, or parole. I go into communities where the consequences of mass incarceration are very devastating. In my state of Alabama, where I work, 31% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote. And you see the kind of implications of all of these issues going on and on. The criminal justice system in the United States is very well defended. Our system treats you much better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And because of that, you see tremendous unfairness. And these problems have caused us to want to say something. I talk about, in my work, a lot about poverty and about the way in which the poor aren't getting adequate legal representation, just like Paul talks about the way in which many poor people don't get adequate medical care. But it's really not enough to talk about these things. You have to sometimes get next to them to really appreciate them. We talk about race, and there's this tremendous problem of race consciousness in the administration of criminal justice. I do work on death penalty cases. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty in part because they'd observed that it was being imposed in a racially discriminatory manner. 87% of the people executed between 1930 and 1972 were black men convicted of raping white women for the crime of rape. 100% of the people executed for that offense were people who were executed for offenses involving victims who were white. And these disparities led the court to say, no, we can't continue doing this. But in 1976, new statutes were passed, and that's how we've gotten to the modern death penalty. And the same argument about race bias was made. Lawyers went to the court and said, look, this is going to be discriminatory, but the court said, no, without evidence of bias, we're not going to presume that. And then there was this third case called McCleskey, which came to the court in 1987. And in this case, there had been a study of the death penalty in Georgia. And what these researchers had found out was that race was the greatest predictor of who got the death penalty. You were 4.3 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim was white than if the victim was a person of color. And armed with these data, the lawyers went back to the court and said, look, this is unfair, this is unjust, you have to strike it down. And the Supreme Court, in a very interesting case, said, we accept your evidence of bias, we accept what you're telling us about racial discrimination in the administration of the death penalty in Georgia, but we nonetheless are going to we're going to rule that it is not illegal. It is not unconstitutional. And the court said two things to justify its opinion. The first thing the court said was, if we deal with race bias in the administration of the death penalty, it's going to be just a matter of time before lawyers start complaining about racial bias in other kinds of criminal sentences, burglary sentences, and property crimes, and other kinds of crimes. And Justice Brennan, one of the court justices, said this fear of too much justice is what led the court to feel like they couldn't do anything about it. But it was the second thing the court said, and I was a young lawyer when this court decision came down, that really turned me around. The second thing the court said was a certain amount of bias, a certain quantum of discrimination, if you will, is in the court's opinion inevitable. And they used that word to characterize these results. And I'll tell you that for the last 20 years when I've been representing people on death row, nothing has been quite as difficult as reading this decision talking about the inevitability of racial bias in the administration of the death penalty. And I say that with some history. We started a project in Alabama in the 1980s to provide representation to condemned people. And I never will forget when we opened our office that year, 25% of the people executed in America were executed in Alabama. And as soon as I got there, a man called me. He said, "Mr. Stevenson, I'm scheduled to be executed in 30 days. Please take my case." I said, "I'm sorry, but we don't have books yet. We don't have staff yet. We don't have resources to handle cases. I can't help you. I feel really terrible, but I cannot take a case yet. We don't have our materials yet. We don't have staff." He didn't say anything. He just hung up the phone. I went home that day. I didn't feel very good about the conversation. I came back the next day, and the man called me again. And this time he said, "Mr. Stevenson, I'm begging you. Please take my case. You don't have to tell me you can stop the state from executing me. You don't have to tell me you can win. You don't have to tell me you can get this execution postponed, but please tell me you'll fight for me." He said, "I don't think I can make it these next 29 days if there's no hope at all." And when he said it like that, it became impossible for me to say no, so against my better judgment, I said yes. And we tried very hard for the next 29 days to stop this man's execution, but it was too late. The court was saying that the time for filing appeals had passed, the time for presenting evidence had passed, and on the night this man was scheduled to be executed, I got that dreadful call from the Supreme Court of the United States telling me that the last stay motion we had filed had been denied. I got in my car and I drove down to this little town called Atmore, Alabama, where our death row is. And I went inside the prison to be with this man before his scheduled execution, and it was very difficult. It was some 30 minutes before the execution was supposed to take place, and I was back there talking to this man, and it was very emotional. And I was holding his hand, and we were praying, and we were crying, and we were talking, and we were having this conversation that I've never forgotten. He was telling me about his day. And he was saying, "Bryan, it's been such a strange day." He said, "This morning when I woke up, the guards kept coming to me saying, 'What can I do to help you?' He said, they came to me in the morning and said, 'What do you want for breakfast?' And then he said, they came to me at midday and said, 'What do you want for lunch?' In the evening, they came to me and said, 'What do you want for dinner?' And he said, all day long, people have been saying, 'What can I do to help you?' And we kept talking, and it was so difficult to have this conversation. And he kept saying to me, 'Bryan, it's just been so strange. They've been asking me, do I need stamps to mail my letters? Do I need access to the phone to call my friends and family? Do I need water? Do I need coffee?' And I will never forget him saying in those last few minutes, he said, 'Bryan, it's been so strange.' He said, because more people have asked me, 'What can I do to help you?' in the last 14 hours of life than they ever did in the first 19 years of life. And holding that man's hands, I couldn't help but think, yes, where were they when you were 3 years old being physically abused? Where were they when you were 7 years old being sexually assaulted by your step-siblings? Where were they when you were 11 and you started using crack cocaine? Where were they when you were 14 and you were homeless, roaming the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, drug addicted with no place to go? And with those kinds of questions resonating in my mind, this man was pulled away, strapped in Alabama's electric chair, and executed. Well, as difficult as that was, it really wasn't as difficult as reading this decision from the United States Supreme Court, because this decision seemed to represent this concession to bias, this surrender to injustice, and I could not make sense of that. I am a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where black children could not go to public schools. And when I started my education, we had to go to a colored school. And in my community, the colored school only went to the 8th grade. And I thought about that when I was thinking about this case dealing with the bias in the death penalty. Because in 1955, the Supreme Court could have said that racially segregated school systems in America are inevitable. There'll be too much conflict if we require integration. But the court didn't say that, and the refusal to say that
made that not inevitable. And I thought about how there had to be this vision, and it became necessary for me to say something about this problem. Well, in my work, it's not just race, it's not just poverty, it's the way in which many people with disabilities are left oftentimes very vulnerable. People who are young. My clients are younger and younger. I represent lots of people who are 13 and 14 and 15 who are facing life in prison without parole. I had a case not so long ago where a young man, 14 years of age, was living in a household where his mother was repeatedly abused. And one day the man who she was living with came into the house and he was drunk and intoxicated, and he walked up to this little boy's mother and he punched her in the face. And she fell out on the floor unconscious. And this little boy, about 5 feet tall, less than 100 pounds, kneeled near his mother, and after a few minutes when this man went into the bedroom and fell asleep, he got up and he went into the bedroom and he started fishing around the dresser until he found a handgun. And then he took this handgun out and he walked over to this man while he slept, and at almost point blank range he pulled the trigger and the man died. Well, he might have been tried as a juvenile, except for the fact that this man, the man who was shot, the man who was brutalizing this woman, was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this young man be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and he was immediately placed in the adult facility. His grandmother called me about 3 days after that and asked me if I would take the case, and I went to the jail to talk to this young man, and he wouldn't answer any of my questions. I started talking to him and asking him questions, and he just sat there. And finally, after 20 minutes, I put my pen down. I said, "Look, you've got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me." And he just sat there. So then I got up and I walked around the other side of the table and I sat next to him and I put my arm around him and I said, "Please talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me." And then this little boy started to cry. And through his tears began talking to me not about what happened at his house, not about what happened to his mother, not about what happened to his stepfather, but he started talking to me about what had happened to him in the jail. And he told me on the first night there were several men who had come into his area who had assaulted. And then he told me on the next night there were several other people who had come into the area who had raped him. And then he had told me about the third night where many more people had come into the area and brutalized him, so many he couldn't identify how many there had been. And for the next hour, I held this little boy while he cried hysterically. And it was very difficult to experience, and it became necessary to say something about it. And we ultimately got him out of that facility, and he's doing very, very well now. He's taken in by some wonderful people, and he recently graduated from a college and is doing much, much better. But the pain of that was very deep. Well, it's not just what happens to young people, it's what happens to people with mental illness, it's what happens all around. And in our society, there are so many places where people are suffering from a lot of things, but what most concerns me is the absence of hope. In many of the places where I work, in this country, I go into communities where 13 and 14-year-old kids tell me that they don't believe they're going to live past the age of 18. In public housing projects, in certain communities where there is so much despair and so much dysfunction, these young folks tell me that they don't think they're going to live past 18, and they don't say that because they're trying to excite me or to do something. They say it because that's what they believe. And this absence of hope begins to shape their lives. They say, "Don't talk to me about staying in school. Don't talk to me about doing this or doing that. I've got to go out and get mine while I can." And this despair is reflected in so many of the ways in which they live and function. Well, these kinds of problems are the kinds of problems that you can find in a host of areas. In healthcare, and how we deal with the elderly, and how we deal with the environment, and how we deal with a whole range of public issues that are important to our general welfare. And I didn't really come here tonight to talk about these problems, but I really came here tonight to talk about the importance of saying something. I'm one of these people who believes that all of us have the capacity to do something that creates justice. I'm one of these people who believe that you don't have to be a certain age, you don't have to be a certain size, you don't have to be a certain race, you don't have to have a certain education to do something that actually creates justice. What you do have to do is have some vision, have some hope. I'm one of these folks who actually believes that you can't give anything to someone that you don't actually have. If you don't have some hope for how to deal with complex problems, how to deal with injustice, how to deal with unfairness, you're not going to be able to do the things necessary to create justice. Václav Havel, the great Czech leader, talks about this in some of his writings. There have been really wonderful things happening in Eastern Europe over the last 15 years. where big and powerful institutions were actually defeated, were broken down with a hope of justice. And Havel says the kind of hope we need to create justice, to create fairness, isn't some preference for optimism over pessimism. It's not some naive belief that everything's going to work out in the end. Havel says the kind of hope we need to create justice is none of those things, but rather an orientation of the spirit. It's a willingness to sometimes stand in hopeless situations, sometimes stand in hopeless places and be a witness and say something. I've learned something about that doing the work that I do, and my clients teach this to me all the time. I handled the case of a man who spent 6 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. It was a really outrageous case of injustice in southern Alabama. A black man was arrested and actually charged with a murder. He was actually placed on Alabama's death row for 15 months before the case ever went to trial. The only case I've ever had where the client was actually put on death row before being convicted of a crime. And, the trial was quite outrageous. It only lasted 2 days. And what was most stunning about this case was that this man was actually at his home with about 30 other people at the time the crime took place, 11 miles away. And when he was arrested, everybody from his house and everybody from the black community and everybody from the poor community went to the police and said, look, you've got the wrong person. He was with us at the time this crime took place. There's no way he could have committed this crime. And they were ignored. The trial took place. They all testified that they had the wrong person, but he was nonetheless convicted. And then he was sentenced to death and sent back to his death row cell. And we got involved in the case after he'd been on death row for a couple of years. And I remember started working on the case, and people would come up to me and they would say, Mr. Stevenson, it would have been so much better if this man had been in the woods hunting by himself when the crime took place, because at least then we could entertain the possibility that he might be guilty. But because we were there with him, we feel like we've been convicted too. We feel like we've been put on death row too. We don't know how to cope with this. We don't know how to make sense of this. And there was this hopelessness in this community that was actually tangible. You could feel it. You'd walk around and you'd just see this despair with so many people. Well, we started investigating the case and we came up with some very dramatic evidence of Mr. McMillan's innocence. It so happens that on the day that this crime took place, a police officer had actually gone by his house. They were raising money for his sister's church. They were selling sandwiches, and the police officer bought a sandwich from Mr. McMillan, our client, and actually put a note in the log that he bought a sandwich at the exact same time the crime took place, 11 miles away. The police convicted this man by getting someone to testify falsely against him. And the unusual thing they did in this case is that they coerced this man to testify falsely, but what they did that was unusual was that they tape recorded the time when they were coercing him to testify falsely. And even stranger, they didn't destroy the tapes after this confession had been obtained. And so years after the crime took place, we actually got the tapes. And when we were putting the case together, we actually had a tape of the witness saying, you want me to frame an innocent man for murder, and I don't feel right about that. Police were saying, look, you don't give us what we want, we're going to put you on death row. And all of this evidence became part of the case that we were making to free this man from death row. Well, on the first day of the hearings when this case took place, we went to court, and all of the people from the poor community, all of the people from the black community showed up to the courtroom. And when I went inside, it was very encouraging to see so many people there hoping for some justice. We put these tapes in evidence. We put these witnesses on who testified that their trial testimony was false. We had a very good day in court, and when I was going home, I saw hope growing in this community. Came back on the second day. When I got back on the second day of the court, I noticed that all the black people, all of the poor people who had been inside the courtroom on the first day were now sitting outside the courtroom. And I went up to the community leaders and I said, well, why aren't you all inside? They said, they won't let us in. I walked over to the deputy. I said, I want to go into the courtroom. He said, you can't come in. I said, well, I'm the defense lawyer. I think I have to be able to come inside the courtroom. He said, well, I'll go check on that. And he checked and he came back and said, you can come in. And I walked inside this courtroom, and on the second day, they changed things around. And on the second day, they'd actually put a metal detector on the inside of the door that you had to walk through. And on the other side of the metal detector, they positioned this huge German Shepherd dog that you had to walk past. The prosecution had brought in people to fill up the courtroom who were sympathetic to their side of the case, and I was really angry because I knew all of these people who had been in court the day before, who were outside the courtroom, were not going to be able to come inside because there wouldn't be enough seats. I complained to the judge, and the judge said, no, you people will just have to get here earlier tomorrow. And I went out and explained to the community leaders what had happened, and I thought they'd be upset, but they said, that's okay, Mr. Stevenson, that's all right. We'll just have a few people be our eyes and ears at today's hearing, and they began identifying people to be witnesses. And they identified this beautiful older black woman who I'll never forget for the rest of my life by the name of Ms. Williams. And they said, Ms. Williams, you can be one of our representatives. And she was so proud to have the opportunity to be a representative of the community. They started letting people inside, and you could see her getting herself together. She put her hat on her head just right. She fixed herself up just right. And they started letting people come inside. And I was inside the courtroom, and I saw Ms. Williams walk into that courtroom with such pride and with such dignity. She held her head up high as she walked through that metal detector. But when she got on the other side of the metal detector and she saw that dog, you could see the fear in her eyes. She stopped dead in her tracks. And I was looking at her, trying to see what she was going to do, and I saw her try to pick up her foot to move, trying to move, but she just couldn't do it. And then her body began to shake, and her shoulders dropped, and she started trembling, and then I saw tears run down her face, and after a few painful minutes, I saw this older woman, grown up, turn around, and run out of the courtroom. Other people made it inside. We had another good day in court. I'd forgotten all about Ms. Williams until I was going to my car that night. And as I was walking to my car, Ms. Williams was still sitting outside the courthouse. And when she saw me, she came over to me and she said, Mr. Stevenson, I feel so bad. She said, I let you down today. I let everybody down today, and I feel terribly about it. I said, Ms. Williams, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. They shouldn't have done what they did. You don't have to feel bad about it. She said, no, no, no. I was meant to be in that courtroom. I should have been in that courtroom, and I just couldn't make myself do it. I tried to console her, but no matter what I said, she just stood there, and then she began to cry. I said, Ms. Williams, it's all right, it's okay, it's not your fault. She said, no, 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 I was meant to be in that courtroom. I should have been in that courtroom. And then she said, but when I saw that dog, all I could think about was Selma, Alabama in 1965. And she said, I remembered how we gathered at the Evan Pettis Bridge in Selma to march to Montgomery for the right to vote, and they put those dogs on us, and I tried to move. I wanted to move, but I just couldn't do it. She walked away with tears running down her face. The next day we came to court, and I was talking to her sister in the morning, and her sister told me that night when Ms. Williams went to bed, she didn't talk to anybody, she didn't say anything to anybody. They said that they could hear her praying in her bedroom all night long. Lord, I can't be scared of no dog. I can't be scared of no dog. Her sister told me that morning when she got up on this next day to court, she was begging the community leaders, and she called them to ask them for another chance to be a witness. On the trip from the house to the courthouse, she kept saying over and over again, I ain't scared of no dog, I ain't scared of no dog. And I was standing there with her family when I saw her come into the courtroom. And she was saying over and over again, even from where I was standing, she was saying, I ain't scared of no dog, I ain't scared of no dog. And I saw this beautiful older black woman walk through the metal detector, walk up to this dog, and say in a very loud voice, she said, I ain't scared of no dog. And she walked past the dog, came into the courtroom and sat down in the front row and said, Mr. Stevenson, I'm here. I turned around and I looked at her and I said, Ms. Williams, it's good to see you here. And a few minutes went by and she said it again. She said, no, Mr. Stevenson, you didn't hear me. She said, I'm here. I was getting embarrassed. I turned around and I said, no, Ms. Williams, I do see you, and I'm glad to see you here. And the judge walked in, and everybody stood up when the judge walked in, and everybody sat back down. But when everybody else sat back down, Ms. Williams remained standing. And the court got very quiet, and people were looking at this older black woman to find out what she was going to do. And then I stood there and watched her stand up and say in a very loud voice, and she said it really loudly, she said, I'm here. And it became clear to me then what she was saying. What she was saying was, not that I'm physically present, she was saying, I may be old, I may be poor, I may be black, but I'm here because I've got this vision of justice that compels me to stand up to injustice. I tell you that story because I believe each of us, all of us, if we really want to advance social justice, if we really want to create the kind of healing that we read about in Mountains Beyond Mountains, if we really want to create fairness in the world, if we really want to create justice in the world, the one thing we've got to be willing to do is to say, I'm here. And when we say it, it resonates in ways that will have meaning beyond that which we can understand. My work has taught me very basic things. Very basic things. I believe that each person, each individual, everyone in this room, everyone outside this room, each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. You see, I think if you tell a lie, you're not just a liar. I think if you take something that doesn't belong to you, you're not just a thief. I believe even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And because of that, there is this basic human dignity, this basic human right that must be protected. And so I am here to tell you that we must find ways to challenge our court when it says that race bias is inevitable. I'm here to tell you that we must find ways to create more equality in the world when people are dying from diagnosable and treatable diseases because they can't get the resources necessary to deal with those diseases. I guess I'm also here to tell you that if you have hope in your heart, if you have some vision that you can say, I'm here someplace where it might make a difference, you need to hold on to that. It's funny because when I was the age of many of these students, I wasn't confident that I could do anything that would actually help anybody. I had thought a lot of times about the ideas that I would need to have in my head to kind of change the world and to change this. And what I've learned is that those ideas that you form in your head are absolutely critical to being the kind of citizens, to being the kind of advocates, to being the kind of activists that can make a difference in the world. But ultimately, those ideas in your mind are not enough to actually create justice, unless they're also fueled by some hope, some vision in your heart. It is oftentimes difficult to say, I'm here. We ultimately prevailed in the case of Walter McMillan. And after 6 years, we won his release, and there were a crowd of people outside the prison on the day he was released from death row. And the first person he went to was Ms. Williams. And he went up to her and he said, Ms. Williams, I'm here because you were there for me. And there was something really empowering about that moment. But it's oftentimes difficult to do that. It's difficult in communities such as this to find ways to give expression to some of these problems, but it can be done. It is oftentimes exhausting. It is oftentimes uncomfortable. It is oftentimes agonizing. But in that exhaustion and in that agony is this wonderful privilege to actually be a witness to the kind of hope that I think we desperately need in this society. I go back to Alabama, and we have all kinds of difficult problems. We've got other people who don't have lawyers who are facing execution. We have very young people who are not getting the kind of assistance that they need. I've got a bunch of folks in the community that are really suffering and struggling with despair. And it's oftentimes very, very rare. I was going to a court not too long ago, and I was thinking about just this dynamic of how your exhaustion can sometimes keep you from being willing to say, I'm here. How it can handicap you. And I'd filed these motions that were very provocative. We were complaining about judicial misconduct in this community. We were complaining about prosecutorial misconduct. We were complaining about police misconduct. There really wasn't no conduct. It was all misconduct. And we filed these motions, and I knew it was going to be a very contentious hearing. I was sitting in my car. I was by myself. I was sitting there thinking, man, this is going to be so ugly. When I go in there and start arguing these motions, everybody's going to hate me. And I sat there for about 10 or 15 minutes thinking that's just how unpleasant it was going to be. And then finally I said, okay, well, let's go. And I opened the car door, and I walked up the steps into this courthouse in South Alabama. And as I was walking inside, this older black man who was a janitor saw me. He came up to me and he said, who are you? I said, I'm a lawyer. He said, you're a lawyer? I said, yes, sir, I am. And at this point, this man hugged me. He said, I want you to know I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad you're here. And it was wonderful because I don't usually get greeted that way when I go to court. And I went into this court and we started arguing these motions, and just as I expected, everything got very tense very quickly. As soon as we started talking about racial bias, as soon as we started talking about the problems of the poor, and we were talking about misconduct, everybody got angry. And other prosecutors started coming into the courtroom, and other police started coming into the courtroom, and other clerk, and before I knew it, the courtroom was filled with people angry that we were talking about these issues. And after an hour, the prosecutor was arguing, and the judge was arguing, and there was a lot of arguing, and I was kind of arguing back, and it got very contentious. And after an hour, everything was so tense in that courtroom that I looked out of the corner of my eye, and I saw this older black man, this janitor, who had greeted me so lovingly, and he was pacing outside the door. And there was a window in the door, and he kept looking through the window, and he kept looking so concerned, and he heard all these loud voices and all this shouting, and he just kept pacing back and forth. And after about a half hour, I saw this older man open the door, walk into the courtroom, and he sat down behind me. About 10 minutes later, the judge said we're going to take a break, and during the break, there was a deputy sheriff who was offended that the janitor had actually come into the courtroom during court proceedings. And this deputy jumped up and he ran across the courtroom, and he went up to this older black man, and he said, Jimmy, what are you doing in this courtroom? And this older black man stood up and he looked at me and he looked at that deputy sheriff and said, I came into this courtroom to tell this young man, keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. The main reason I came here to Concord is because I believe that there is hope in this community for justice. I believe there's vision in this community for changing things and creating fairness in places where there's desperate needs for fairness. I believe that there are people in this community willing to say, I'm here in places and at times when it is desperately needed. And I know I may not be talking to everybody, but to the people I am talking to, I came here to tell you to keep your eyes on the prize and hold on. Because if you do that, and you let those words ring out, you do create a world where justice is possible. And I say that in places where I see a great deal of injustice. And so in that spirit, and with that hope, let me celebrate and commend you again for being willing to come together and at least for this moment say, I'm here. All of you, keep your eyes on the prize. and hold on. Thank you.